as well. So, thank you very much, and we'll move on now to Victor Asal and Karl Rethemeyer.
Okay, so first I want to thank CID for organizing this event, inviting us, and just in general, thank you for all that you do. I think it's enormously important, very much appreciated. I also want to introduce the work that we do this way. All of you who have siblings, please raise your hand. All of you who at some point have wanted to kill your siblings, please raise your hand. Okay. Karl and I, not recently, just at some point, Karl and I do not study that. That's called criminal justice or criminology. Most murders are done by family members, loved ones, business partners. They're done by people you know. Political violence is people getting on a bus, going 400 miles out of their way and blowing up a bunch of people they've usually never met before. And so it's a different question, because if I really, really hate you, and I've spent 15 years working with you, Karl, I have lots of reasons to blow you up, but why would I blow up a bunch of people I don't know? And we look at this at an organizational level. The other aspect of the research, has anybody here ever been asked, no, but where are you really from? Anybody? Okay, how annoying is that? Right, very. So we also look at societal discrimination and legal discrimination, and we believe that there's an important connection between discrimination and oppression and political violence. And we're going to touch on some of that in this presentation, but we'd be happy to talk more about that during Q&A or afterwards. So what we're going to be presenting here, our focus is an organizational focus. We agree with Nilofer that one explanation does not explain everything. You really have to look at an assortment of things coming together. Often it's how these things come together. And we're going to be presenting research on two different data sets. One that looks at violent organizations, insurgents and terrorist organizations that have already chosen violence, and that's cross-nationally. And then another, and that's the bad, big allied and dangerous, or bad data set. And being able to say to somebody, look at our bad data set makes me very happy, so it's a good title. The other is the MARA, Minorities at Risk Organizational Behavior data set, and that looks at ethno-political organizations in the Middle East and North Africa and in Eastern Europe and Russia, and it looks at minority ethno-political organizations, some violent, some not, and we're able to look there about the differences between violent and non-violent organizations in terms of their behavior, but also why some organizations become violent. And in this presentation, we're going to be focusing on why these organizations would turn to criminal activity as a basis for potential further conversation, specifically focused on human trafficking. Now, when we think about this, we like to use this meta-theoretical model. As I said, not all things happen because of one factor. So if we're looking at behavior, some behaviors are because that's the organizational goal. The organization wants to achieve something. This behavior fits into that organizational goal. But it's not always about that. Sometimes there are goals or behaviors that are not just based on our desires or ideologies. Sometimes it's based on attributes. So for example, is there anybody here who thinks I have potential in the NBA? Okay, you're lying. Okay? Up until recently I could say just because I'm too short, now I can say I'm too old. But in any case, I don't have the attributes that are going to make me successful. Some people do. So our capabilities matter. In addition, relations. Has anybody here gotten something because they know somebody? Okay, everybody here has gotten something because you know somebody. And sometimes you've gotten bad stuff because you know somebody. Your older brother they don't like, so they don't like you. So network relations, connections to other people, other organizations can have an impact on what happens, but also the environment. What kind of, are we in a democracy? Are we in a dictatorship? Those kind of factors can also impact. So it's not all of these factors impact all behaviors, but often a lot of these factors in interaction are having an impact on what kind of behaviors organizations choose. And this particular context, what we're looking at is we're looking at the choice of, and we see human trafficking as a criminal activity. So we're looking at criminal activities. What are these factors that drive these kind of criminal activities? And so, to summarize, some behavior is motivated by goals and ideology or discouraged by goals and ideology. Some are what the organizations want to do. Some of those are motivated by opportunity, and some is motivated by both. So first we're going to look at the bad data set.
So let me say a few things about this particular data set. When we started doing work on terrorism and insurgent organizations, one of the things we discovered is that there was no data on terrorist and insurgent organizations. So we have spent the better part of the last 14 years, God help us, collecting this sort of data. The Big Allied and Dangerous data set currently contains 580 organizations and has yearly data from 1998 to 2016, and we're continuing to extend that. The research that I'm going to talk about today is an abstract of that. So we are interested in terrorist organizations, that is, organizations that engage in killing civilians for a political purpose, but we're also interested in insurgent organizations. And there we use a definition from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, which is, has the organization killed at least 25 people in battle, people that are in uniforms. So this work is really looking at, do insurgents engage in criminal activity? And to try to look at that, we know about a number of variables, but importantly, the size of the organization in terms of its membership, the ideology that it espouses, the structure internally, including things like leadership, whether it's hierarchical or a network structure, and then violent and nonviolent behavior. We also have information on how these organizations interconnect with each other. So I'm the social network mechanic on this particular project, so I'm really interested in how relationships between organizations turn into the ability to do bad things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do if they didn't have friends. So specifically, the kinds of crimes that we look at are things that we think are related to trafficking in persons, but we haven't had the funding currently to try to collect the dependent variable. But we have taken a look at and are about to publish a piece of work that looks at the engagement of insurgent organizations in drug crimes, in smuggling, in extortion, robbery, and kidnapping for ransom. So again, these are instances of criminal behavior that have some of the same characteristics as human trafficking, but it's not exactly the same thing. So when we thought about this particular question, we looked again at things that are along that arrow that Victor was just showing. So, and these are factors that we think tend to help to explain all the behaviors that insurgent and terrorist organizations are likely to engage in. So it's things like, how large is the organization? Does the organization control territory? Because if you control territory, you have a place you can set up shop and you're not going to get stomped on by security forces at a regular basis. State funding, and we have to actually think about state funding sort of from two directions. State funding can sometimes help you do more things because you have more money or you have more arms or you have more expertise. At the same time, state funding means that you have somebody looking over your shoulder and probably does not want you to become overly aggressive or overly violent, because that entices other states to get involved and to actually stop either the organization or to attack the country that is engaged. We also look at criminal network connectivity. We look at several ideologies, the nature of leadership, whether or not the organization provides social services, because there's a growing literature on the importance of social service provision as a way that terrorist organizations attract adherents and may also affect the things they're willing to engage in. And then the question of age. As organizations get older, they become more adept at doing complex types of bad acts, but they also become too legit to get involved in some other kinds of activities. So sometimes, for instance, in our work on weapons of mass destruction, the older the organization is, the less likely they are to get involved in that, because it interrupts their ability to be recognized as legitimate in broader international society. So when we took a look at this, we discovered that there was one factor that mattered across the board. Insurgent organizations that control territory get involved in all types of crime that we were looking at. And then some forms of crime are related to ideology, to social service provision, or age. And if we broke that down a bit more, some of the crimes that are similar to human trafficking, like kidnapping, there's a set of factors that seem to matter: territorial control, alliance ties, and social service provision. Extortion, again, territorial control and alliance ties. leftist ideology and age, and then smuggling was just related to territorial control. So one of the things that we are interested in learning more about in the context of human trafficking would be whether or not ideology matters. And specifically, we know in some other contexts that ideology really drives certain types of behavior choices by organizations. We know that environmental terrorist organizations and animal rights terrorist organizations never kill people because it's inconsistent with the ideology they espouse. So it could well be that in the context of human trafficking, ideology also matters, whether or not the organization will get involved. And similarly, there may be constraints that come from state sponsors that are not interested in being known and affiliated with organizations that engage in human trafficking. We're going to turn it back over to Victor to talk about the MAROT database.
Got 9 minutes.
9 minutes, that's a sea of time.
That's a sea.
Okay, so ethno-political organizations. The MAROT data is data that collects information on ethnic groups. Some of them are violent, some of them are not. It's based on the Minorities at Risk organizational behavior data set. And as I said before, we've got data on MENA and data on Eastern Europe and Russia. And this could be all sorts of different organizations. So here are some examples of organizations of the Kurds in Iraq, Palestinians in the occupied territories, or Shia in Lebanon. Some are violent, some are not. We collect data on all sorts of organizational behavior, organizational characteristics, ideologies, grievances, leadership type, external support, IGOs, NGOs, I don't have to explain that to this particular audience, foreign state support, diaspora support, as well as organizational relations. And so why turn to crime? So one explanation, possible explanation, is that repressive states leave fewer resources so that organizations can turn to crime because they need those resources. Ideology, some ideologies, the literature would suggest, push organizations away from criminal activity, so leftist and religious organizations. Diaspora support, if you have colleagues and people who support your organization in other countries, that's creating a network that can benefit crime. The IRA certainly took advantage of this in the 70s and the 80s, both for terrorist behavior but also for criminal behavior. I will note that these kinds of criminal activities is rare. It is a rare event. There are not that many organizations, and since we're looking at both violent and non-violent organizations, it's rare, so we had to use rare event logit for doing this analysis. The first analysis in terms of crime, so for Eastern Europe and Russia, and both for the Middle East and North Africa, the easiest way to know if an organization is going to be a criminal organization also is if it did it last year, okay? Which means basically we keep doing what we're doing. But that's less interesting than the other factors that are impacting this. So organizations that are in democracies are far less likely to be criminal organizations because they have opportunities to pursue their political purposes without turning to illicit means. Leftist organizations are less likely to be less likely to be criminal in Eastern Europe and Russia. In repression, if an organization is repressed by the state, it is much more likely to turn to crime. Organizations that are blowing people up are also likely to be criminal, and organizations that have diaspora support, both in the Middle East and North Africa, are more likely to turn to crime, significantly more likely to turn to crime. And again, in Middle East and North Africa, if the organization is violent, it is more likely to turn to crime. Now, we also have another analysis of drug trafficking in MENA, which gets close to this idea of trafficking. The trafficking process is similar. And again, there's this issue of controlling territory. If you control territory, you have space to do stuff without being intervened that is going to help you. But also when it comes to trafficking, we thought organizational competition and interorganizational violence should have an impact, because if you're involved not just in issues with the state, but if you're involved in violence with other organizations, you need more resources. You will turn to some unpleasant kinds of behaviors if you need those resources. What we found is organizations that control territory are much more likely. Organizations that are involved not in competition with other organizations, but if they're involved in violent competition, they are much more likely to turn to drug trafficking. As is diaspora support makes them more likely. Religious organizations are less likely. And this brings in the importance that ideology can sometimes play in the behavior of organizations. And organizations being targeted by states for violence are 4 times more likely. So across all of these analyses, we're finding some factors that seem to really have an impact across these, and we believe that they are likely to have an impact in terms of human trafficking, although there might be distinctions between regions, not might be, there are very likely to be distinctions between regions, as well as the type of violence these organizations are doing, and their political purposes. And we'd also be very interested in looking at when these organizations, we don't have this data, but it's something on our agenda, is when these organizations are using their resources to counter human trafficking. Because if we can get that answers to that question, I think that would be extraordinarily useful also. And on that note, how much time do we have?
4.
4 minutes.
Yep.
We're going to finish 4 minutes early.
Oh, very good.